The Cursed Ring from the Völsung Saga. A 13th century Norse epic called the Saga of the Volsungs has continued to capture the imagination. In the story we regularly meet the god Odin, who appears disguised as a one-eyed hooded old man who helps out families which produce great heroes, including the Volsung family. At one point, Odin lodged a mighty sword into a tree that only the hero Sigmund could remove. And one generation later, this sword was reforged by Sigmund's son Sigurd, who used the sword to kill the dragon Fafnir, who guarded a great treasure from the world of the dwarves. The most precious item of this treasure was a ring, which all creatures, gods, dwarves, dragons, valkyries and men wanted to possess. But the ring was cursed by the dwarf Andvari when the gods stole it from him, causing the death of everyone who owned it. And this great medieval story would later become inspiration for Wagner's Ring des Nibelungen, and of course also for Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And curiously, the story even stars Attila the Hun of all people, the mighty nomad king from the Eurasian steppes, who invaded the Roman Empire centuries earlier. So, we have a lot to get to. Let's start. Hey, good to see you. This is Stephan, author of In Search of the Sublime. On this World History channel, we'll trace humanity's relentless pursuit of scientific truth, moral excellence, and enlightenment. We'll meet anyone from Mesopotamian astronomers and Indian yogis to Greek philosophers and Enlightenment scientists. And you'll meet them firsthand using primary sources, giving you valuable insights that transcend the surface level understanding you get on other channels. Go check it out for yourself. Let's start. Let's begin with some background information. There is only one surviving manuscript of the Saga of the Volsungs, and this was written in Iceland. And on the screen, by the way, you see the modern name of this document if you want to look it up online. The manuscript itself dates to about 1400 AD, although this version of the story was first written down between 1200 and 1270 AD. And even this version is based on far older Norse poetry known as Eddic poetry, which developed orally before the year 1000. And although the story spread far and wide in Europe, it was finally preserved only in Iceland, as the Icelanders in the 13th century became prolific writers. In fact, almost all Norse narrative material that has survived was written there in Iceland. Besides this one manuscript, we also have a short summary of the saga in Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, also from the 13th century. And there's also a story with much overlap, called the Nibelungenlied, or the Song of the Nibelungs, which was likely written in Austria around 1200 AD. And here, by the way, the main character is called Siegfried instead of Sigurd. And Beowulf, the great Anglo-Saxon tale about the hero Beowulf who slayed the monster Grendel, which dates somewhere between 700 and 1000 AD, also briefly mentions the Völsung story. It mentions Sigmund Völsung, which in Old Norse became Sigmund Völsung, and it named him as the killer of the dragon, instead of his son Sigurd in the later legend. Interestingly, although the first part of the saga clearly sets in a mythical realm including dwarves, dragons and gods, the second part subtly includes many historical figures. The story describes historical wars between the Burgundians, the Huns and the Goths, all tribes that clashed with the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. The Burgundians were a tribe that migrated to Europe and eventually ended up in France inside the Roman Empire. And the saga mentions a historical king from the Burgundians, namely Gunnar. And the saga also mentions Atli, better known as Attila the Hun. The Huns were nomads from the Eurasian steppes, who were skilled and often cruel horseback archers. Some scholars believe they are also related to the Xiongnu tribes, against whom China erected its Great Wall, but this hypothesis is not yet proven. And the saga, by the way, also contains an old memory that Attila died in his sleep after drinking too much, which we also read in the historical records. The mainstream story at the time was that Attila choked because of an internal bleeding. But there were also rumors at the time that a Germanic woman who was with him that night might be the killer. And in the Völsung saga, his killer is also a Germanic woman. One character that needs some introduction before we dive into the story is Odin, the god of wisdom. In the story, he often appears disguised as an old hooded man with one eye. In other sources, we read that he had given up his other eye in exchange for a drink from a well of wisdom. Odin was also known to send out so-called Valkyries, who were winged females who took the best dead warriors from the battlefield and brought them to Odin's grand hall called Valhalla. And it was believed that those warriors would one day help Odin during Ragnarok, the foretold end of the world, when monsters would destroy the gods. In the saga, Odin supports the Völsung family for generations, knowing they will eventually produce a great hero, the great hero Sigurd, the main character of the saga. But interestingly, the name Odin isn't often mentioned in the story, but his presence has to be inferred based on how he is described, as you will see later on in this lecture. In almost all cases, the people who meet this man have no idea who he is. And finally, there is the matter of the ring. The dwarf Andvari was forced by the god Loki to give up his magical ring, which is called the Andvaranautur, literally meaning Andvari's gift. And then, out of spite, the dwarf cursed the ring, causing everyone who obtains it to suffer and die. As we shall see, the ring will pass through the hands of gods, Loki and Odin, humans, Dreifmar, Sigurd and Gunnar, a dragon called Fafnir, and a Valkyrie called Brynhild, continually bringing death and despair to these people. And this idea was later picked up in Wagner's opera called Der Ring des Nibelungen from 1848. Here the ring became one of the main characters of the story. It's even in the title of his play. And we read explicitly that it gives the wearer the power to rule the world, which wasn't in the original story. Tolkien, in his Lord of the Rings, also made the ring a main character. Here it is also directly in the title. We know he intensively studied not only the saga of the Volsungs, but also Wagner's Ring, but he later denied any influence from the story, stating, "Both rings were round, and there the resemblance ceases." But this is unlikely true. Now, let's tell the story of the Volsungs. The saga begins with a man named Sigi, an ancestor of our main character Sigurd. The first line reads, "Here we begin by telling of a man who was named Sigi, and it is said that he was the son of Odin." Later in his life, Odin helped Sigi to assemble an army, allowing him to become a king over a country named Hunland. Sigi's son, Rerir, would become an even more powerful king. Yet his wife, we read, could not get pregnant. Odin then solved this issue by sending one of his Valkyries, a maiden named Ljoth, who appeared in the form of a crow, who brought King Rerir a magical apple. His wife ate the apple and then bore a son named Völsung, whose name would later become synonymous with their family line. Völsung then married the Valkyrie Ljoth, and together they had 10 sons and 1 daughter. The eldest son was named Sigmund, and he had a twin sister named Signy. When Signy grew up, her father arranged a marriage for her, against her will, with a Swedish king named Sigurd. We also read that King Völsung had a beautiful palace, with in its hall a huge tree. We read, "A huge tree stood with its trunk in the hall, and its branches with fair blossoms stretched out through the roof. They called the tree Barnstock." And it is now told that when the people were sitting by the fires in the evening, a man came into the hall. He was not known to the man by sight. He was dressed in this way. He wore a mottled cape that was hooded. He was barefoot and had linen breeches tied around his legs. As he walked to the barnstock, he held a sword in his hand, while over his head was a low-hanging hood. He was very tall and grey with age, and he had only one eye. He brandished the sword and thrust it into the trunk, so that it sank up to the hilt, He then began to speak. "He who draws this sword out of the trunk shall receive it from me as a gift, and he himself shall prove that he has never carried a better sword than this one." Then the old man walked out of the hall, and nobody knew who he was or where he was going. Then many noble men tried to pull the swords from the tree, but all without success, until Sigmund came forward. He easily pulled the sword from the trunk. King Sigurd then offered for the sword 3 times the sword weight in gold, but Sigmund refused. King Sigurd then attacked with his army. Volsung's sons were all taken prisoner, and the rest of his men were killed, including King Völsung himself. Each night a wolf then killed one of his sons, until only Sigmund was left. His sister Signy then secretly covered his face with honey, so that the wolf would lick his face, after which Sigmund would bite his tongue. And while King Sigurd assumed that the wolf had done his job, Sigmund fled and built an underground dwelling in the woods. Signy then swapped shapes with a sorceress, and then slept with her own brother Sigmund, and then gave birth to a son named Sinfjötli. And then Sigmund trained Sinfjötli to help him kill King Sigurd, as revenge for what he had done. Later in his life, Sinfjötli fought over a woman with another man, but he was poisoned in the process. Sigmund, overcome with sorrow, picked up his dead body and carried it home, but his route at some point was blocked by a fjord. But luckily he saw there a mysterious man with a small boat. We read, "There he saw a man in a small boat. The man asked if he wanted to accept from him passage across the fjord, to which Sigmund said yes. But the boat was so small that it would not bear all of them, so they decided that the body was carried first, and Sigmund walked along the fjord. And then, the next moment, the boat and the man disappeared before Sigmund's eyes." And here we've met Odin, of course, here in its function as psychopomp, that is, the guide to the world of the dead. Later we read that Sigmund also fought over a woman with another man, the woman this time called Hjördis. When their armies clashed, a strange man with one eye and a hooded cloak approached Sigmund with a spear. Sigmund then struck the spear with his sword, but the sword was shattered, breaking into 2 pieces. And afterwards Sigmund and his army were defeated. Sigmund was mortally wounded, and then said to Hjördis, "Odin no longer wants me to wield this sword." And he then added, "You are carrying our son, and this sword is meant for him. It will be called Gram, and it will serve him well." Their son was named Sigurd, and he was placed under the care of a foster father named Regin, the son of a wealthy man named Reithmar. One day Sigurd went into the woods, where he came upon an old man with a long beard. The man offered Sigurd a horse, saying, "Raise this horse carefully, for it is descended from Sleipnir." And Sleipnir was Odin's own 8-legged horse. One day Regin said to Sigurd, "You have too little wealth. Let me tell you where a great treasure lies. If you could take possession of it, it would bring you great glory. It lies but a short distance from here, at a place called Gnitaheath, and it is guarded by a serpent named Fafnir." Regin then told Sigurd how Fafnir came to control this great treasure. He said, "My father Reithmar was a wealthy man. He had 3 sons, Fafnir, Otter and myself. Fafnir was the largest and fiercest of us. Otter was a fisherman by trade, and he was very successful because by day he assumed the shape of an otter and was able to catch many fish. And Regin himself became a smith, working in iron, silver and gold. One day the gods Odin and Loki approached a waterfall where Otter, in the shape of an otter, was catching salmon. Loki, wanting something to eat, then killed the otter with a stone and skinned him. But the otter's brother Fafnir and Regin then seized the gods and forced them to pay compensation for the death of Otter. it was agreed that they had to fill the otter's skin with gold. Loki then coerced a dwarf named Andvari to provide this gold. We read, "There was a dwarf named Andvari. He was always in the waterfall called Andvari's Fall, and he was in the shape of a pike and caught food there for himself. And there Loki caught the dwarf in a net. Andvari gave up his treasure, but at first he tried to hold back one golden ring, and when he was finally forced to give this up as well, he cursed the ring. We read, when Andvari had handed over the gold, he kept one ring back, but Loki took it from him. The dwarf then went into the rock and said that the gold ring would be the death of whoever owned it. And only in the Prose Edda, which gives a summary of the story, do we hear of one of the powers of the ring. We read, when they got there, the dwarf produced all the gold he possessed, and it was a very great sum of money, but he kept back in his hand a little gold ring. Loki noticed this and told him to give the ring. But the dwarf begged him not to take it from him, saying that if only he were allowed to keep it, he would by its means become wealthy again. But Loki said that the dwarf was to be left without a single penny. He took the ring and left, and then the dwarf declared that the ring would destroy everyone who owned it. The gods then handed the gold to Hreidmar, except for the ring, which Odin wanted to keep for himself. They then placed the gold on the otter's skin, covering the entire otter except for one whisker. And because of this, Odin was then forced to give up his ring as well. We then read that Hreidmar did not want to share the treasure with his sons, not even a single penny. Out of jealousy, Fafnir then killed his father and took the treasure for himself. His brother Regin also wanted a piece of the treasure, but Fafnir also was not willing to share. Instead, he turned himself into a dragon to protect the hoard. We read, Fafnir became so ill-natured that he set out for the wilds and allowed no one to enjoy the treasure but himself. He has since become the most evil serpent and lies now upon this hoard. And in the Edda version we read, Fafnir went up to Gnita Heath and, making a lair there, turned himself into a dragon and lay down on the gold. After hearing this story, Sigurd agreed to kill Fafnir, but as long as Regin would first forge him a mighty sword. Regin, being a smith, made him a sword, which Sigurd then put to the test. Sigurd struck it against an anvil, but the sword broke. The smith then made a second sword, but with the same result. Sigurd then received the pieces of Sigmund's, his father's broken sword, from his mother. And Regin then reforged this sword. Again, Sigurd tested the strength of the sword, and this time he split the anvil in two. And with this great sword, Sigurd then went to the hearth of Fafnir. When they came close to the dragon's lair, they found a track through which the dragon crawled to get water. Regin advised Sigurd to dig a trench to hide in it. We read, and then you stab the serpent from beneath when he crawls for the water. Then an old man with a long beard appeared, who advised Sigurd to dig also a second trench in order to carry away the serpent's blood. And then this man disappeared again. Of course, this was Odin once more. When the serpent crawled along the track for water, he passed above Sigurd, who then plunged his swords upwards through the serpent's heart. And then we read, the dying creature thrashed about fiercely, thundering, "Who are you who dares to attack me?" And he then said, "Upon my death you may well take my treasure, but you shall receive little benefit from it. It will be your death. I advise you to ride away from here while you still can." Sigurd then cut out the serpent's heart and began to roast it over a fire. And when juice foamed out of it, he tested it with its fingers to see if it was done. And then he put a finger into his mouth. And as soon as the serpent's blood touched his tongue, he could suddenly understand the language of the birds. Some birds nearby told Sigurd that he would become the wisest man after eating Fafnir's heart. And they also told him that he should be aware of Regin, who would at some point betray him and take the treasure for himself. And then they told him that a fair woman named Brynhild lies asleep at a place called Hindarfell. And here, by the way, we see a beautiful carving of the scenes we have just discussed. At position 1, we see here Sigurd roasting the heart of the dragon. At position 2, we see the birds talking to Sigurd. At 3, we see Regin with his head cut off, next to his forging equipment. At 4, we see the great horse of Sigurd. At 5, we see Sigurd stabbing the serpent from underneath. And at 6, we see the skinned otter. And now we continue the story. Sigurd followed the advice of the birds. He cut off Regin's head and then ate Fafnir's heart. And then he went to Brynhild, who was located on a mountain that appeared to be on fire. When he approached her, he saw a warrior dressed in full armor. But when he took off the warrior's helmet, she turned out to be a woman, a Valkyrie to be precise. Her coat of mail was so tight that it seemed to have grown into her flesh. With the sword Gram, Sigurd then cut it open, awakening the woman. Brynhild then told Sigurd that during a war between two kings, Odin favored one king, while she, as a Valkyrie, granted victory to the other. Angered by this, Odin then stabbed her with a sleeping thorn. And he also said that I would never afterwards have victory. And he also said that I must marry. And then I made the counter vow that I would marry no one who knew fear. And then Sigurd, the hero without fear, and Brynhild promised to marry each other. But at a later point, Brynhild foresaw she was not destined to marry him. She told Sigurd, but Sigurd protested and gave her a golden ring, Andvari's ring to be precise, and they renewed their vows. Then we read of a powerful king called Byock and his wife Grimhild, a sorceress. Their sons were named Gunnar, Hogni and Guttorm, and their daughter was named Gudrun. The evil Grimhild knew that Sigurd loved Brynhild, but she wanted to advance her own family by marrying Sigurd to her daughter Gudrun. As a result, she prepared a magic drink for Sigurd, which caused him to forget his love for Brynhild. And Grimhild then also attempted to marry her son Gunnar to Brynhild. Brynhild then hid inside a castle behind a wall of flames and claimed that she would only marry a man who could ride through the flames. When Gunnar failed to pass through the flames, Sigurd exchanged shapes with him, which Grimhild had taught them. And Sigurd, disguised as Gunnar, was able to pass through the flames. That night they slept in the same bed in the castle, but Sigurd placed a sword between them out of respect for Gunnar, so their bodies did not touch. But, confused by Grimhild's potion, he did exchange the cursed ring that he gave her earlier with another ring. Soon afterwards, Gunnar and Brynhild married, but it didn't take long before Brynhild recognized the ring on Sigurd's finger. And then she realized what had happened. As a result, she felt betrayed by both Sigurd and Gunnar. Brynhild then convinced her brother Guttorm to kill Sigurd. She then prepared a stew of snake and wolf flesh and fed it to Guttorm, which made him violent. Guttorm then mortally wounded Sigurd, but Sigurd did manage to throw his sword, cutting Guttorm in two. Gudrun, his new wife, woke up drenched in Sigurd's blood, and then let out a loud scream. But Brynhild, hearing the scream, laughed aloud. However, her laughter soon turned into tears, and overcome with grief and guilt, she stabbed herself with a sword. The cursed ring had done its job. As her last words, Brynhild did ask to be cremated together with Sigurd, which was granted. Grimhild then married Gudrun, her daughter, against her will, to no one other than Attila the Hun, who is called King Atli in the story. and who is actually described as Brynhild's brother. King Atli figured that Sigurd's gold, which he got from the dragon Fafnir, including the ring, would now be in the hands of Gudrun's brother Gunnar. Atli then challenged Gunnar in battle and captured him. But bravely, Gunnar said to Atli, "You shall never know the location of the treasure, for I am the only person alive who knows, and I shall never tell. The Rhine, we read, shall retain control over the gold. It shall never decorate the arms of Hans like you." So here we read that the final destination of the treasure and the ring was the bottom of the river Rhine, the mighty river from Germanic mythology. And in fact, Wagner called the first part of his opera about the ring Das Rheingold. Then King Atli placed Gunnar in a snake pit, with his hands and arms securely bound. His sister Gudrun then threw a harp in the pit, which Gunnar played with his feet, thus charming the snakes. But after a while, one adder managed to bite him anyway, causing his death. Another victim of the ring. And finally, Gudrun approached Atli when he was asleep after drinking too much, and he thrusted a sword into his chest, killing the mighty king. And thus unfolded the saga of the Völsungs and the Cursed Ring. I hope you were inspired by this story, and if you want to read more about medieval history or any other topic from world history, read my book In Search of the Sublime. You can read it completely for free on worldhistorybook.com, or you can buy a physical copy on Amazon. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.